In this video, I will present my second argument against materialism and for Panentheism, the argument from consciousness. This is the knockdown, conclusive argument, I think. See whether you agree. In the movie The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy wants to find her way back home. Glinda, the Good Witch of the North, suggests that she go to see the great and powerful Wizard of Oz, who surely will be able to grant her wish. And so Dorothy sets out on her journey, which turns out to be an adventure quest full of strange new friends, apple-throwing trees, sleep and death-inducing puppies, dangerous flying monkeys, horses that change color, and, in the end, a fake wizard. However, despite being a charlatan, this wizard is able to grant Dorothy's wish, because she has had the power to grant her own wish ever since she received the ruby slippers. All she has to do is click her heels together and say, "There's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home." This works not because of magic, but because there is an aspect of reality that Dorothy in Oz doesn't know about. She doesn't know that she is not actually in Oz, but rather dreaming in her bed, having been knocked out of her waking consciousness by having the house she was in carried off by a tornado and thrown violently to the ground. Here's the point. She has had with her throughout her time in Oz all that she needed to settle her question. How do I get back home? Here's a similar literary analogy. In Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Purloined Letter, the unscrupulous Minister D has stolen a letter containing compromising material about the Queen, oh no, that he has been using to blackmail her. Police search D's home thoroughly, but do not find the letter because D has hidden it in plain sight, thinking that the police will not consider the letter left in plain sight because something of such importance would be carefully concealed, obviously. Here's another analogy. The late great novelist David Foster Wallace uses in a famous commencement speech the following old observation. If you ask a fish, "How's the water?" she'll say to you, "What water?" Well, like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz and the police in The Purloined Letter and the fish in the adage, everyone has been carrying around with him or her the utterly obvious, knockdown, conclusive evidence that deterministic, reductionist scientific materialism is false. But a lot of people have missed this evidence because it's too obvious, it's too familiar. The second argument, the argument from consciousness, can be simply stated. Consciousness, which all of us experience, is not at all like any physical thing. It is not different in quality or quantity. It is different in kind from material things. Any of the feeble contemporary attempts to derive consciousness from an underlying material stratum is doomed to failure from the get-go. Why? Because whatever its origins, and we can debate those, consciousness is not a physical thing. Yes, there are neural correlates of your conscious experiences, but these are not your conscious experiences. Your conscious experiences are not material things. You can't put them in a box and sell them on Amazon, for example. This should be obvious. The world contains this non-material thing, consciousness. My own suspicion is that the physical brain is a sort of transducer and receiver that translates some part of the one, the great spirit, the mystery, the universal consciousness, the oversoul, whatever you want to call it, into an individual manifestation of itself. If that sounds odd to you at first, think about how odd it is that there is a universal electromagnetic field and a universal Higgs field and so on, all of these invisible probability fields spread throughout the natural universe, and that all matter is actually excitations in those underlying fields. This is our contemporary science, folks, and it's counterintuitive, but it's correct. In fact, quantum field theory is more accurate to many more decimal places than has been any other scientific theory ever. By the way, a brief note on that word theory as used in science. It's not a hunch or a guess. It's a body of mathematical law with predictive power consistent with repeated, precise observation. The late Daniel Dennett, philosopher, called one of his many books Consciousness Explained. He should have called it Why, Even with My Gifts, I Can't Explain Consciousness Away. Dennett gives a compelling account of how various unconscious events occur in our brains and how some of these come to our attention, and he makes jolly good fun of what he calls the, quote, Cartesian theater, quote, with its, quote, homunculus, end quote, inside, watching the show. But he stops just short of explaining away consciousness, and there's a reason for this. It can't be done. That cannot be done. I shall argue that some of the pre-theoretical intuitions that non-philosophers have about the reality of consciousness are surprisingly robust, clear, and distinct, while the dismissal of those intuitions by orthodox contemporary professional Anglo-American philosophers who, by and large, accept some version of physicalism or functionalism is an article of faith, strong enough to cause them to dismiss that which is not only the clearest, most distinct of our understandings, but also prerequisite to any clarity or distinctness. For the physicalists and functionalists, believing is seeing. Theirs is a kind of theology, and as Wallace Stevens says, theology after breakfast sticks to the eye, end quote. It keeps you from seeing. There are many, many binary oppositions that seem to entail a default dualism on the part of those who employ them. Mind, body, immaterial, material, physical, universal, particular, proposition, sentence in a language, use, mention, a priori, a posteriori, sentience, non-sentience, being for itself, being in itself, thought, action, nominal, real, rule creating, rule following, subjective, objective, first person, third person, predetermined, teleological, non-teleological, experiencer, experienced. For example, contemporary reductionists who would exorcise mind from our vocabulary as though it were necessarily a ghost in the machine aren't taking, I think, a scientific attitude with regard to the mind-body problem. George Santayana wrote in Reason and Religion that it's easy enough for a worm-eaten old satirist to poke fun at the scientific inaccuracies of religions, but it's much more difficult to account for religion itself. The same is true of the default dualism that informed the development of all those binaries I just listed. The burden is upon us as philosophers to account for the fact of the overwhelming tendency throughout the centuries of philosophers and non-philosophers alike to carve up nature in that way. That most people, some pre-theoretically and some theoretically, have considered it given that such binaries carve nature at its joints, to use an unpleasant but apt analogy, is itself a fact of nature that it is the job of our science to observe and explain. That these binaries are perfectly intelligible and that each is well attested in our experience of the world means something, and as I hope to show below, means more than simply that we've always been confused, as when we thought that the sun rose and night fell. The inescapable fact is that intelligibility itself requires an ontological entity to which a concept can be said to be intelligible, that spooky, non-material, experiencing mind consciousness that reductionists so anxiously wish to rid us of. Let's deal with the last of the challenges to reductionism first. It's simple enough to create physical processes that instantiate functional analogs of concepts, such as the sum of an addition. But there's a difference between such a set of processes and an entity such as ourselves that experiences the having of concepts. That's the point, of course, of John Searle's Chinese warm Gedanken experiment, which has never been adequately refuted. People who identify the two are making a category mistake, as surely as do those who confuse, say, use and mention. What is true of concepts and other ideas, such as beliefs, is true as well of qualia, of experiences. One can say that my experience of pain entails that I have these C-fiber impulses. Such an experience does, except in a few bizarre, wildly pathological states. But one cannot say that the experience is those. C-fiber impulses and experienced pains are ontologically distinct entities. The experience of pain is nothing material. It's not a material thing, the experience itself. A feeling is not the neural impulses that give rise to it. A mind is not a brain. Entailment or supervenience is not identity. One cannot make the mind-body problem go away, as, say, Richard Rorty attempts to do in Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, by claiming that it's just a matter of using the language wrong, of hypostatizing a predicate and making it a subject, in which case the pain is terrible is like redness is yummy, a loose use of language. Rorty's argument is a little more complicated, but that's what it boils down to. The mind-body problem and the universal's particular problem are no more the same than a proposition is the same as the English or Swahili sentence that states it. Again, this is the use-mention error. Only a highly conditioned analytic philosopher could come to Rorty's conclusion, and it is conclusions that preposterous that give philosophy a bad reputation among people who think that philosophers are supposed to be more careful in their thinking than the rest of us are. Though, of course, there are highly trained analytical philosophers, Saul Kripke, for example, who don't speak so outlandishly on this subject. See his discussion of pains and brains in his wonderful book, Naming and Necessity. Because of the concomitance of physical and mental states, there is, of course, a sense in which talk about mental entities, experiences, states is adjectival, and it's philosophically interesting that that's so. But one can't say, as Rorty does, that making that observation dissolves the mind-body problem. Neither is there anything scientific about trying to do so. A scientist does not ignore some facts, in this case the experience of entertaining a thought or feeling a pain, just because they are inconvenient. Instead, a real science says about unexplained phenomena, there are some things that I don't yet understand. There is no shame in that, quite the contrary. So, we must accept the fact that non-material consciousness is a reality. I'll take this a step further in my concluding talk in this series. Dennett dismissively called, he's deceased now, those who think that there's a hard problem of consciousness Mysterians. But isn't it the proper response to a mystery to say that's mysterious? What other response is possible except silence? One must sit down before the facts like a little child, Thomas Huxley said. That statement is in the true spirit of science and of philosophy, And it is in this spirit that we must reject the reductionist materialist program that runs from Laplace through the Vienna Circle misinterpreters of the younger Wittgenstein to Eyre and Carnap and Ryle to the 20th century behaviorists and the contemporary physicalists, functionalists, and heterophenomenologists, a program that simply ignores much of what requires explanation. As Einstein is reputed to have said, but did not, to our knowledge, actually say in precisely these words, our job is to seek answers that are as simple as possible, but not simpler. Qualia, perceptions, bodily sensations, mental imagery, emotions, and other mental experiences, representations, beliefs, concepts, goals, intuitions, are not the physical processes on which they supervene. The world we experience has this dual aspect. As David Chalmers put it, that I have toes and thoughts are very different things. That's simply the way things are. The universe contains us and other sentient entities with these spooky things called experiences that are not material, and professional philosophers need to accept that if they are to stop talking what is clearly errant nonsense. I want you to imagine for a moment a grandfather and his grandchild watching a PBS production of Romeo and Juliet on television. Romeo finds Juliet in the crypt, seemingly dead, and kills himself. The grandchild exclaims, "Why did he do that?" The grandfather explains that a television camera recorded some actors in the studio, that the analog recording was edited and sampled and digitized and stored as orientations of metal filaments on the disk drives, that the recordings were played back by means of a mechanism that translated those orientations of metal filaments into streams of photons sent down fiber optic cables to a set-top box that transduced them into streams of electrons shot by a gun onto a fluorescent screen at one end of a cathode ray tube. Whew! An explanation like the grandfather's, which could be much elaborated, might be close to complete, though it cannot, our science tells us, be complete. But it is not an answer to the daughter's question. Why did he do that? Which is asked at a completely different design level about phenomena at a completely different design level about an experience. Some reductionists have fallen back on an epiphenomenal account of consciousness. Yes, experiences are quite real, but they ride on top of and are entirely accounted for by bottom-up systems, whether or not these are conceived of as deterministic. However, it should be obvious enough to those with scientific dispositions that nature is rarely so frivolous, so lacking in economy as to create something complex that serves no purpose whatsoever. It's a violation of the economy, the parsimony, so evident everywhere in nature, to believe that experiencing does not itself play a causative role top down. It's difficult to understand why the same sorts of people who would accept as wholly reasonable the heuristic of, say, cladistic parsimony, motivated by repeatedly confirmed economy in nature, would think of experiencing as an inconsequential, non-causative free rider. It would be the ultimate irony, wouldn't it, if that were so? That to which things matter is the one thing that doesn't matter. Absurd. It's a crazy idea, but it's widespread among our contemporary scientists and philosophers. The stubborn persistence of Anglo-American academic philosophers and scientists in their denial of mind is almost enough to make one think that David Chalmers' philosophical zombies actually exist. Maybe there are such entities, and they all hold chairs in philosophy, and for them, pains are just C-fiber impulses because they don't have a clue, or a functional physical process resulting in an output interpretable by a sentient consciousness as a clue, about what it means when people talk about the experience of pain. Maybe these zombie philosophers are marvelous to behold, philosophy machines of enormous sophistication, but just don't have any there, to borrow Gertrude Stein's marvelous phrase. Dennett points out that people are default dualists. As an evolutionist, he should have taken pause at that. It's like saying that we're default eaters or default procreators. We're that way because it is possible for stuff to have experiences, because having experiences itself confers survival value to reproduction, enables us in this minimal sense to fare well, and evolution is a machine for faring well in the world. There's nothing supernatural about any of this, of course, for whatever is the natural, isn't it? Or we could say, I guess, the natural is the supernatural. But there's nothing to suggest that experiencing is necessarily explainable by creatures such as us or by any creature living in a universe constructed like ours. Perhaps in the mind-body problem we are bumping up against our current cognitive and perceptual limits, or against more fundamental limits to any understanding that we might ever develop. There is much in nature that remains mysterious, much that our science tells us must remain mysterious, much that many think is not knowable in principle, such as the precise simultaneous position and momentum of an elementary particle. Some of the Gnostics said that first there was Sophia and that she gave rise to Eros, but they had it backward. First, there was the raw fact that some entities fared well and others didn't. Processes gave rise in time to a spectacularly successful means for faring well, to sentience, and to an essential characteristic of sentient entities, the ability to reason, which is deeper than and considerably antecedent to the ability to create symbolic representations. I suspect, as Ginsberg and Jablonka have argued, that sentience is very, very ancient, that the first life forms with some version of sentience arose at the end of the Precambrian, and that event in the history of life accounts in part for the Cambrian explosion, because, of course, even rudimentary sentience has enormous survival value. Perhaps inexplicable experiencing and the making of choices acts upon the substrate that first gave rise to it, making it different in ways that confer survival value. Perhaps reasons are fundamentally different from reactions, as the naively unphilosophical are inclined to think when they contrast a twitch with a grasp. Certainly, the choices that we make at the wholly different design level of the experiencing mind affect our wiring. Philosophy, if it is to be, in fact, fundamental, needs to go back to its source, to its spring. It should conceive itself as the art of applying reason to the goal of faring well, which is why reason evolved in the first place. While I'm disassociating myself from a number of received notions current among reigning philosophic and scientific intelligentsia, I might as well add this. It's a commonplace of evolutionary theory that evolution is not teleological. But once it created conscious minds, it became teleological, didn't it? I think the indigenous have it right that everything has some level of consciousness, and perhaps there's this level to which things reach where that consciousness becomes teleological. Certainly in our case it has, hasn't it? We have purposes. See my talk on the meaning of meaning. And finally, should we survive? We're in the process of becoming the designers of the designing process itself, and may even in time use technological means that exploit the supervenience of the mental upon the physical to develop the means to bridge the ontological gap between entities, my mind over here, yours over there, as perhaps other entities have already done throughout the universe. That's a very interesting and exciting possibility, isn't it? Fraught with potential dangers and rewards. But it does seem that we are headed in that direction. And again, as was true after the arrival of sentience, everything changes. Everything changes when we start designing the design process. By the way, even now we have a rough means for bridging the ontological gap between entities, of course. We call that means love. Okay, please like, subscribe, comment, share these videos with your friends and relatives and everybody else. And thank you for listening.